Hello, genealogists. This is Craig again with Just Genealogy. Today, I want to talk to you about Revolutionary War Pension Act. So, I'm going to go through these one by one, and we'll talk about amendments to them and those kind of things as we go through each one so that you can see what the nuances are associated with each act. And then at the same time, I'll talk about where you can find the records that are in fact involved with these specific acts. So the first act of the Revolutionary War was to provide half pay to Continental officers and enlisted men who were disabled in the war to continue for the duration of the disability and to be paid by the states. Now, notice it says to be paid by the states. So that means that you should be looking for Bachstrock's book on Revolutionary War state pensions or some of the individual state pension books like from Virginia. So basically, this is an example of the Continental Congress making a law and then telling the states to pay it. And this doesn't actually change until 1792 when the federal government, which is now the federal government, it isn't at this time, it's the Continental government, takes over both the pension and bounty land requirements for the various states in order to acquire the land northwest of the Ohio River, the Northwest Territory. So the second act was the act of 15 May 1778, and it provided for half pay for 7 years to Continental officers who served for the duration of the war. Remember, a lot of the Continental officers went home after the White Plains rearrangement. So this only is for those officers who actually stayed through the war. And then in 1780, a couple of years later, on the 21st of October, there was a law to take that half pay and change it from 7 years to life. And then in 1783, it was further amended to provide full pay for 5 years. Now, at the end of 5 years, it would then come to an end. So that would take them up to 1788. On 24 August 1780, there was half pay for 7 years to widows and orphans of Continental officers who met the requirements of the previous law. Unfortunately, all of these acts before 1818, any of the paperwork generally associated with them were probably lost in one of the two fires in the early 1800s, one being during the War of 1812 when the British came to visit Washington, D.C. So unless they survived into 1818, we may not have any information that deals with these individuals specifically. Notice that this is a 7-year half pay, whereas in the future, what we're going to be dealing with in future wars like the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, they're going to be 5-year half pay. So on 29 September 1789, this provided for invalid pensions. That word is invalid, not invalid, but invalid pensions previously paid by the states that would be continued to pay for 1 year by the federal government, and the time limit was subsequently extended. So they start doing it year by year until 1792, and then it just continues pretty much forever for these Continental officers, and only Continental officers. So we're not dealing with any enlisted men at all yet. On 3 March 1805, this extended eligibility for not just officers for invalid pensions, but to all persons who became disabled after the war as a result of wounds received during the war. Of course, it would also, because they were wounds received during the war, they would also probably be disabled during the war also. So it's not just after the war. Basically, if you're disabled, you're entitled to an invalid pension for your service in the Revolution. Now, this will move forward until the Civil War. This war will apply, and it's variously extended along the way. There is a pension ledger for these that's available on Ancestry. The 1806 Act extended eligibility for invalid pensioners to those who had served in state troops and in the militia. So previous to this time, these were purely continental invalids. They were not militia or state troops militia. Now, state troops means somebody who's paid for by the state. For example, the 1st Virginia Continental Line is not state troops. Those are continental troops. But the 1st Virginia state troops, those are state troops and are paid for by the Virginia government. The militia, if they stayed at home and did not leave the county, were not paid at all. The militia, if they left the county, would probably be paid for by the state as a function of how long they were away from the county. But again, these are invalid pensioners of both state troops and militia, so this act is additive to the 1805 Act, which was only continental invalids. Then we have the law that we are probably most familiar with, one of two, which provided a pension for life to officers and enlisted men in need of assistance who had served in the Continental Army or in the Naval Service for 9 months or until the end of the war. So this is your Continental Line longevity pension. Before this time, all those pensions were for disability, not for living long enough. So this is the first of the gratuitous pensions. The government actually didn't have to do this, but there was such a hue and cry that they decided to do it. And there were a lot of people who came in and qualified for this. It, in fact, provided this pension because of the need for assistance, but it had no measures by which one could determine what the actual need was. It had no person who was responsible for validating that need, and there was no mechanism other than application, and they just ignored the concept of need and just gave the pensions out. At this time, I'm not sure that the government realized how big a deal this actually was and how expensive it was going to be, and recognized that we are only 3 years after the War of 1812 ending, and the government still has this enormous debt from the War of 1812 that it's attempting to pay off without much luck. So in 1820, they decided that every pensioner who was receiving payments under the 1818 Act had to provide a schedule of their estate and income, and it authorized the removal from the rolls of those considered not to be in need of assistance. Now, what was strange about this law was only one person could determine, according to the law, whether someone was in need or not, and there was no criteria established by the law as to what defined need. So the Secretary of War, a man by the name of John Wood at the time, was responsible for determining whether someone in fact was in need. So he would, you may see them in pensions, you'll see a letter from him saying that yes, you're entitled to the pension. I've only seen one of those in my life, and I've been looking for them. You will also find published works talking about pensioners removed from the rolls or pensioners struck off the rolls. And that's not a bad thing. It just means that the government did not determine that your pensioner, in fact, was in need of assistance. So I know of at least one book on Kentucky that's called Kentucky Pensioners Struck Off the Rolls. And these were just people who the Secretary of War determined didn't need this pension. Now, I don't know about you. I'm a Navy pensioner, and if the government all of a sudden decided that I would no longer be entitled to a pension because, let's say, I was on Social Security, which I am, and so I wasn't indigent anymore, wasn't in need of assistance. Although I'm quite sure there's some people out there who think I am in need of assistance. That's not what we're talking about right now. I would not re-elect any congressman who voted for me no longer to get a pension. And our ancestors aren't much different than we are. I'm sure that none of our ancestors who were receiving pensions under the Act of 1818, who all of a sudden lost it under the Act of 1820, were very happy with their congressman who voted to take their pension away. Well, congressmen then are no different than congressmen today. And in 1823, they restored all of those people that they struck off the rolls back to their pension. They basically said that there no longer was a need requirement. The, you basically they although the law said you were subsequently able to prove your need, basically after 1823, if you applied for the pension and you had the service that was appropriate to the pension, you're going to get a pension so long as you could prove that service. In 1828, they provided full pay for life to surviving officers and enlisted men who were eligible for benefits under that Continental Congress resolution of May 1778 and as they amended it during the years. So that just extended the Continental and the enlisted guys forever, but by 28, a good number of them were already gone. And in fact, by 1832, there was such a hue and cry for the militia men who had served in the war and those who did not serve through the war but had resigned before the war was over because, for example, the White Plains Arrangement. So the Act of 1832 provided a pension of full pay for life without a need requirement to officers and enlisted men who had served at least 2 years in the Continental Army, the Naval Service, and state troops and militia, but were not entitled to benefits under the resolution of 15 May 1778. And for those that had served less than 2 years, but not less than 6 months, they would receive less than full pay. It worked out to about half pay. The hardest thing for militiamen to do, because they usually didn't serve for a full 6 months at one shot, was to prove their 6 months. I know of a lot of rejected pensions where they were able to prove 5 months or 5.5 months, but were just unable to get to that 6 months. So that 6 months is probably the major reason for rejection during this act. So in 1836, the government provided another form of gratuitous pension. That's a widow's pension. And it provided that the widow of any veteran who had performed service as specified by the Act of 7 June 1832 was eligible to receive the pension that might have been allowed the veteran under the Act during her widowhood if she had married the veteran before the expiration of his last period of service. Generally, this means that these are individuals who married prior to the end of the Revolutionary War. There are very few individuals who remained in what would become the regular army from the Revolution to the regular army. Just not very many people. So basically, based on this act, widows who married someone prior to or during the Revolutionary War is going to get a pension. Now recognize that those individuals under the Act of 1832, that those under the Act of 1818 were still eligible under the Act of 1818, but they also would have been eligible under 1832, meaning a widow who was eligible under 1818 would also be eligible. So both widows of soldiers of 1818 and of 1832 were eligible if she married the soldier prior to the expiration of his service. Now, the Act of 1838 provided a 5-year pension to widows during their widowhood whose marriage had taken place before 1 January 1794. So what they're doing is they're moving the marriage date back a little bit. So it's now gone from probably 1782 to 1794. And that these pensions continued under the acts of 1843 and 1844. Basically, they were just extended. And then in 48, they provided life pensions. So they got rid of the 5 years and the extensions. And under 48, again, still had to be married before 1 January 1794, but now these are life pensions. Now, the Act of 29 July 1848, so we've got two 1848 acts, provided life pensions during widowhood to widows who were married before 2 January 1800. So again, the marriage requirement has now moved to the day after New Year's of 1800. In 1853, it removed the restrictions as to date of marriage for a widow's pension period, so it didn't matter when the widow actually had married the soldier. She would then, under the Act of 1853, be entitled to a pension. Then there is the Act of 1878, and it provided life pensions to widows of soldiers who had served for as few as 14 days or who were in any engagement during the war. Now remember, the soldiers themselves, the minimum they had to serve was 6 months in order to qualify for a pension. And now this gratuitous pension for widows of 1878 will pay those widows for as few as 14 days or for any engagement during the war. So these are the Revolutionary War pension laws. Now what's missing from this discussion is at the same time, beginning in 1805, 1806, we have the Old Wars Act, which extends the invalid pensions on for the War of 1812 and the Mexican War. And then in the 1870s, 71 and 73, we have for the longevity pensions for those soldiers who served in the War of 1812 and those widows of soldiers who served in the War of 1812 in 1873. So those things are going on at the same time. Remember that any disabled soldier is going to be under the Old Wars Act. Now, when you're looking at the pensions for those individuals in 1812, even though they're under the Old Wars Act, if they're militia or state troops, they're going to be among the War of 1812 pension records, as are the Creek War pension records in the War of 1812 collection. The regular Army folks from 1812 and the Marine Corps and the Navy are going to be in the Old War pensions collection. So that concludes today's session on Revolutionary War pension law. It's always important to understand the law before you actually look at the application files. Someday soon we'll break down a couple of Revolutionary War application files. If you've got somebody that you would like me to take a specific look at because you've got a question about something that's in their pension, just let me know and I'll add it to the list of things that you all want me to do, and we'll take it from there. Again, this is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy, where we're converting people doing genealogy into genealogists day by day. I appreciate you all very much. I guess after 20 sessions, I can say to you, if you hadn't subscribed yet, please do. And I appreciate your views, and I appreciate your comments, and I especially appreciate it when you subscribe and click that bell so you're notified when a new one comes out. I will see you tomorrow.